Ready for our next speaker? Who's excited? Got a whole afternoon of great stuff coming up. It's my honor and privilege to introduce John M. Goodman, PhD. And he regards himself as a recovering Christian. He works with an organization called California Clean Money Campaign, which is about transparency. How about that idea? And he's also an inventor and author. Ladies and gentlemen, John M. Goodman, PhD.
I want to think rationally about population issues with you this afternoon. And that means that I'm going to have to share some facts, but I'm also going to share a framework with which you can think about it rationally. So first I'm going to ask a question, are there too many of us? And then I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Population Science 101. This, by the way, is that lecture that you heard mentioned earlier, a 1-hour lecture squeezed into 25 minutes. What that means is I'm going at a very high level, and I'm going to show you some charts that I won't have time to discuss in detail, unfortunately, but perhaps you can look them up later yourself and go into it. I'll also give you a brief history of the world population, and then I'm going to go into something very important and very much not known by enough people. There's a very surprising connection between energy, prosperity, and population. And if you don't understand that, as I think unfortunately many people in the population issue area do not, you may give wrong advice to people. And then I'm going to ask the question, well, what would be the optimum world population? Some people have come up with numbers. Some of them I think are wrong, and we can talk about that. And then a summary, and I'm going to close with 2 slides where you might want to have your camera out to take a picture of the screen, because one of them is reading recommendations and the other one is the data sources I used that you might want to use so that you can look up for yourself the information, make the same graphs I've made, and see if you can study them and learn a lot from them. There is a lot there to be learned. So first, do you recognize this number? Anybody can call out what you think it means? Yeah, here's a hint. This is the world population today, 7,419,217,863. Now that precise number either will or already has appeared on the worldometer.info website. They have a clock that keeps clocking along every few seconds. Every few seconds it changes. It is, of course, not a real-time measure. We do not know how to do this to detect every birth and every death. But it's a very good estimate. And from this site, if you study it, you can learn a lot more facts about population, including such things as, at the present time, the population of the world is increasing about 230,000 people per day. That means that in 4.5 days, there are another 1 million people on the planet. And in 12 years, there'll be another 1 billion people. Is this too many people? Well, I want to pose this question to you 2 ways. First, is this too many people for the Earth to support indefinitely? In other words, is this a sustainable population? And the second one is this more than the optimum number of people? And by optimum, I mean the number of people on Earth that would let the average person have the best possible chance for a good life. At this point, I want a show of hands. How many of you think that this population that we have now, 7 billion plus, is already more than we ought to have on the planet? It's a pretty popular position. Now, how many of you think it's not too many people? It's a minority view right now. I'm putting my hand up. I do have a caveat, and I will explain that at the end of my talk. For those of you in the majority who thought that this is already too many people, I want to point out that there are many people in history who have taken that position. Probably the most famous would be Thomas Malthus, and Paul Ehrlich, and Dennis Meadows. They all were concerned about limitations on the resources that the Earth can provide to us. We need things to live. The Earth is finite. Obviously, it has a limited amount of land and water and every mineral there is, and many of these things are essential for life, so clearly an infinite population is not sustainable. But is the present population sustainable? Is the future population that we're going to have sustainable? And I'll talk about what that future is. We know pretty well where we're going in the next 30, 40 years, and fairly well where we're going to be by the end of the century, absent an asteroid crashing into the Earth and wiping us all out, or something like that. Here are those 3 men, the dates on which they published their books, and their picture of them and also of their book. Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principles of population with its application to life. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And there is a subtitle or a supertitle right over the title there that I thought you might enjoy. Population Control or a Race to Oblivion. And down at the bottom he says, while you're reading these words, 4 people died of starvation, most of them children. Limits to Growth came out 4 years later. This is a very famous book. It was commissioned by the Club of Rome, written by a team of scientists led by Dennis Meadows at MIT. And what they were doing is assessing, well, how many resources do we know, how much do we have of each of the critical resources, and how fast are we using it up, and how soon will we run out if we don't find more of it? And his conclusion was there are several things that we would run out of in the next 3 decades or 4 decades prior to now. So all of these people were saying, because of limits, I think we are in trouble. If we have more people, we're going to run out of things faster. We really ought to control it. In fact, Ehrlich was so convinced of this, he founded a group called Zero Population Group, ZPG. They've recently renamed themselves, they are still in existence, they renamed themselves to be Population Connection. And one of the better things about them is that if you join, you get a nice glossy quarterly magazine called Population Connection, where you can learn a lot of interesting facts and facts on the ground, and also explanations of those facts in terms of the best science right now. Unfortunately, they are still preaching the message, everybody needs to control population by just not having so many babies. I mean, just get willpower, man up, do it. Somehow it doesn't always work. This is the world population at the time those 3 men wrote their books. There weren't even 1 billion people on the planet when Malthus was scared that we'd run out of food for everybody very soon. We now have 7.7 times as many people as there were when he wrote that, and almost everybody is getting fed. Paul Ehrlich, when he wrote, was considerably closer to the present time, less than 50 years ago, and there were about half as many as there are now, and same with Dennis Meadows. Notice only 4 years later it was another 300 million people. So these doom and gloom people apparently missed something, because we are still here. We are eating. There are more people than they thought was possible. And we're actually thriving rather well in the developed world, and people in the developed world are striving to thrive. So I'm thinking maybe they missed something important. What could that be? Well, one of the things they may have missed, they may have underestimated humans. Humans are amazingly inventive. When presented with a really serious problem, when push comes to shove, we often are able to come up with a technical solution that lets us muddle through and go on. Agriculture is a great example. In just the last 40 years, a factoid I got out of this magazine, we have increased the world's agricultural output by 115%, while increasing the arable land by only 8%. So we have managed to double, or more than double, our agricultural efficiency. And that's the kind of technical fix I'm talking about. But more significantly, I think these authors all fail to realize what the real drivers are that cause population growth. And until you understand that, you can't possibly give people the right advice. And now, by the way, we have a new problem, actually much more important than the limits problem. A lot of people, I think many of you who raised your hand, think that we would run out of something critical if we had too many people, and maybe we already have too many and are going to exhaust those resources. I'd say no. At least so far, we are not running out of critical resources. But what we do have is this new problem. In 1988, the UN established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And since that time, they have been mandated to collect and review all of the best science on climate, and then publish an assessment report every few years. They have done 5 assessment reports, the most recent one in 2013 and 14, and they're big volumes of information, lots of data, lots of detail, but they paint one overwhelming picture. Humans are in control of the global climate now, and what we are doing to it will be very disastrous for us in the fairly short term. I think that unchecked, in about maybe 100 to 200 years, humanity will no longer be able to live on Earth. It will be uninhabitable by humans, and that means we will go extinct. And it wouldn't be the first. I mean, species go extinct all the time, millions of them. And millions more pop up into the now vacated environmental niches. I'd hate to see us join that troop. I'd rather we stick around. I think most of you would too. Notice that the IPCC's worry is not at all about limits. It's all about overabundance of the waste products of our activity, specifically carbon dioxide. And specifically, the reason for that waste product is we're burning fossil fuels and biomass, and anything you burn that's organic makes carbon dioxide. Bill Blass had a cartoon in the Times I thought I would put in for the moment of levity in this talk. Only moment, I suspect. In case you can't read it in the back of the room, the father is saying to his son, "Someday, son, all this will be yours. It'll be underwater, but still." And sea level rise, while one of the serious problems, is by no means the worst one. But this is not about climate change today. This is about population. So I'm going to go on to talk about the real key to population growth. All human beings, I think, share two things they want. They want to survive, and they want to thrive. And they're aware, on some level at least, that every time their prosperity increases, their odds of survival and thrival increase, if thrival's a word. So humans are effectively hardwired to seek and grab and hold on to prosperity any way they can get it, anytime, anywhere. And if you try and get in the way of their prosperity, they will resist. Now, how do these human drives change population? For that, you need to understand a framework. And the framework I'm talking about is called the demographic transition. Another show of hands, please. How many of you have heard of the demographic transition? How many of you know what it means? Well, there were a few tentative hands, and now there are fewer. Congratulations to those who know, but now I will try to answer in the next 5 slides what it is. It is a process that the people who study societies, the demographers, have discerned that every human society seems to go through in 5 stages. Here they are. Stage 1, think 10,000 years ago. Humans were all in little bands of hunter-gatherers, barely subsisting. A fair fraction of them died each year because it's such dangerous business going around and hunting game and maybe falling into pits when you're trying to collect things that are just out of reach, whatever. A lot of them died. If they didn't have a lot of babies, they would have disappeared. So they had a lot of babies. And by the way, a fair fraction, a large fraction of the people who died each year were the babies or the young children. So you had to have a lot of children in order to have at least some of them grow up to become old enough to have children themselves and have a next generation. At that point, the birth rate is very high, the death rate is very high, but they're in sync, and so the population is stable, although low. As soon as a little prosperity comes into their lives, it turns out that there are many ways this can happen. The first way, I think, was the invention of agriculture. You have some resources, spare resources, and what do you want to do with them? Well, because your first drive is to survive, the first thing you do with spare resources is defend yourself against the things that are trying to kill you. And you get somewhat successful, and your death rate falls. But your birth rate is still high. Now, here's a piece of simple arithmetic. The population of this tribe at the end of the year is equal to the population at the beginning of the year plus how many people were born minus how many people who died. Simple arithmetic. And that applies to any community, anytime, anywhere, right up to the present. I'll add another term when I talk about modern societies. In any case, if there's a difference between birth and death rates, the population at the end is some percentage higher than it was at the beginning. And if those rates are unchanged, the next year it's the same percentage higher than that. This is called exponential growth. And that's what has happened and does happen in any species when it is confronted with a birth rate higher than a death rate. Now, I've shown the death rate falling in 2 steps. And by the way, I should talk about the scales. This is not a to-scale drawing, only indicating direction, rising or falling. and for the birth rate, the death rate, and the population. And time and prosperity go to the right, but they are not in sync. Time just flows by, but prosperity comes episodically when we have great inventions and other occasions. So you can go for thousands of years across this chart and stay in stage 1 or stay in first part of stage 2. When you get another burst of prosperity, you can lower your death rate even further, and then the population rises even more rapidly. And eventually you get to the point where the culture is so well developed that two important things happen. One of them is you now have tools and machines to do things that child labor used to do, so you don't need to use children as a part of the workforce. And this has an impact because it's expensive to have children. You have to, after birthing them, house them, feed them, clothe them. In these first early stage 2 and stage 1, they were a part of your assets. You ask a man how wealthy he is, he will count how many children he has, how much livestock he has, and how much land. They are assets. But now, in your developed culture, they are liabilities, because not only do you have to clothe, house, and feed them, you also have to educate them, and they don't go to work at age 5 or 6 or 8 or 10. They may not become productive members of society until they're 25 or later. I say this to those of you who may have had the experience of a child or a grandchild who was not a productive citizen for a very long time. So, at that point, people make a choice. They decide not to have as many children. You may not think that's a choice, but it is. And it's a choice that they make because it clearly is in their best interest, in their prosperity interest. So those same drives that led them to have babies in the first place now drive them to have fewer. It turns out it doesn't really matter what religion they have, what culture they're in. It is helpful if you will teach people about contraceptive technology and make it available to them. It is very helpful if you'll educate the girls and the women and especially empower them to do something other than having babies and raising families. But apart from all that, the critical issues are having sufficient prosperity and sufficient stability in your culture and a low enough death rate that you can reasonably anticipate, even if you only have a few children, most of them will grow up to be of reproductive age and the next generation will go on. And at that point, people will find a way to lower their birth rate. As the birth rate is falling, you'll notice the population is still rising, but it's rising slower and slower until the birth rate falls all the way to the death rate, at which point you're into stage 4. Now, the birth rate and death rate are equal, same as in stage 1, but at a much lower level, and the population is stable, same as in stage 1, but at a much higher level. And there is a 5th stage that was sort of theoretical until very recently, but in just the last few decades, almost half of the countries on the planet have moved into stage 5, where the birth rate falls below the death rate and the population begins to decline or decay, also exponentially. We don't really know how that's going to play out because it's such a new phenomenon, we have no experience with it. But we're clearly in that game by now. Here is the world population history. Now, you've probably seen this. I'm going to apply this framework to the actual history of the humans on the planet over the last 12,000 years. I want you to see if you can pick out which stage of the demographic transition we have been in as a species over this time. Here's the usual curve that people draw. Each block along the bottom is 2,000 years. Each block going up is 1 billion people. This is a very boring chart. What it tells you is that until about 2,600 years ago, there was hardly anybody on the planet. And then all of a sudden, oh, there are 100 million. And then 200 million. And then suddenly just a couple of 100, 300 years ago, it started screaming up pretty darn fast. And less than 100 years ago, it's going almost vertical. That's a fairly uninformative graph. But if I take those same data and plot them with a different vertical scale, instead of an equal number of people in each vertical block, I'm going to use an equal ratio of population. It's called a logarithmic scale mathematically. So this is a log linear plot, or if you're an engineer, it's a semi-log plot. a billion, 10 billion at the top, then 1 billion, then down to 100 million, down to 10 million, down to 1 million. As you look at this, the first thing that strikes you is that for 5,000 years, from 12,000 years ago till 7,000 years ago, the population of the Earth was almost constant. Clearly, stage 1 behavior. It was between 4 and 5 million people. That's all. But 7,000 years ago is when we invented agriculture, and look what happened. The population started going up. Now, I've drawn an orange line there that's a straight line, and on this kind of a graph, that's what exponential growth looks like. And a characteristic way of describing exponential growth, how fast it's going, is to talk about how long it takes for, in this case, the population to double. And in this case, it takes just over 1,000 years. So every millennia, as it clocks by, there are twice as many humans on the planet. Again, 2,600 years ago, something else happened, and it went up quite a lot faster for a little bit, and then it leveled out at, you can see, almost the same slope. And then it dipped down a little bit, and it's a little more noise in there. And then it took off at a much steeper slope, and then it's going this almost vertical again. We need to magnify that upper right corner to see what's really going on. Here is a graph that goes from 1750 all the way through to 2100. The black line is actual data. The colored lines at the right are extrapolations, and I'll talk about them in a moment. At the lower left, you'll see that as we entered this time, already, instead of a doubling time of 1,000 years, the doubling time was under 200. So it was more than 5 times faster growth at that point, because there was a modest amount of new prosperity in that time frame. And then in 1860-ish, something dramatic happened, and the doubling time fell from 185 years to only 85 years, so more than twice as fast growing, and that's almost entirely because of the discovery of petroleum. And it happened after World War II even more dramatically, with the doubling time dropping to 38 years. But something important happened there. If you look at the growth rate of the world population, and you can look this up online, you'll see a curve that comes up and to a peak and then starts to taper down. The peak was in 1962. That's when the world entered stage 3. We began to reduce our global population, and so the growth rate began to curve down. Now, at the right, the dashed green line, ending at 10 billion with a level population, that's what the UN demographers predicted for the year 2100 when they published it in 2010. In 2012, they published a correction. They said, oh, we thought that the population would have stabilized, that everybody would have completed their demographic transition, at least to stage 4, but we've noticed that the countries in Africa that are really poor aren't doing that quite so fast. So we now know there will be at least 11 billion people. The population will still be rising in 2100. We're not sure how much higher than that it might be. If the demographic transition is stalled in all of those countries and stays stalled, we might end up with 19 billion people by the end of 2100. Prosperity, I keep saying, drives this demographic transition. I'd like to show you some evidence for that. But first, I need a definition of prosperity. You may have thought about this or read about it, and you may realize that there's more than one way to define it. I'm going to use the economist's definition, mainly because it's the easiest one to get the data for, so that I can make the graphs I wanted to make. Their definition is the gross domestic product of a society divided by the population of that society. It's essentially your individual share in your culture, your society's gross domestic product. That's how rich you are. That's how prosperous you are. Then I just go to the CIA World Factbook and look up the data. This, I don't know if you realize this, the CIA created for their purposes this fact book that contains a lot of demographic facts about every nation on earth, ranging from the largest, China, down to a country that has fewer residents than there are people in this room today. And they give you these demographic details for all of them. Now, to avoid small sample statistical fluctuations, I have limited myself to those countries that have at least 10 million people. And I've plotted their prosperity versus their fertility. That's not the same as birth rate, but it's closely linked to it. Clearly, if you have more babies, your birth rate is higher for a given population. And this is not a scatter chart, a random arrangement, and it is not a trend line, so it's different. Let's see. I'm going to draw a couple of lines and some boxes on it. That vertical salmon-colored bar goes from a fertility of 2.2 to 2.4, and that's generally thought to be replacement fertility in any society with a fairly low mortality rate. In other words, if the death rate has been pushed down pretty far, anything in that range, and you can stabilize the population. You might think it should be 2. If two parents produce a child, or 2 children, and one of them is a girl, and then she produces 2 children, and then goes on, you'd think that would work. Well, 2 problems with that idea. First is we have more boys than girls, and some girls don't grow up. They die, or they just choose not to have kids. Either way, you need a little more than 2 for replacement fertility. Anywhere below about 2.2, and you can pretty well guarantee that that society will have its population declining. They will be in stage 5. It's a modern world. We're intercommunicating a lot, and so there's a lot of immigration and emigration going on. And so that formula I gave you before is not quite complete. The population at the end of the year equals the population at the beginning plus the births minus the deaths plus the people who came into that society minus the ones who moved out. Simple enough. I think I'm running low on time, and that's a problem because I want to get further. Here are the names of some of these countries. I will not take time to discuss it. I'll just point out there are 38 countries in the developed group in the pink box, and there are 38 countries in the orange box. And there are only 9 countries that manage somehow to have low fertility even though they have low prosperity. And there's one outlier, Malaysia. I'll come back to each of those later. This is the final connection you need to understand. This is the one that most people don't understand. Energy is absolutely crucial to prosperity. Every animal needs food to do what they do. We eat, you just had lunch. And that food you metabolize to get energy to run your body so that you can think, and so that your gut can digest other food, and so that you can use your muscles. But all of that ends up as heat eventually. So each of you is glowing in the infrared around as much as a 100-watt light bulb. If you add it up over the year, roughly, on average, a human being gets 1 megawatt hour of energy per year. Animals, that's all they get. We actually get more. Worldwide, the average consumption of energy right now from non-food sources is 20 times as much as we get from food. And in the United States, it's 80 times as much. That's why we have such a high standard of living, and it's what other countries aspire to. We are generally envied worldwide because we have energy and they don't. Very explicitly, Modi from India, Premier, I think, in India, said during the Paris talks in the UN meeting there about climate change, he said, "Don't lecture us developing world about how much energy we're using. We want to use energy like you did so we can get developed like you are. We need it." And he's right. Here is a plot. This is, again, not exactly a trend line, but there is a trend line, that colored line I've drawn. This is prosperity vertically and energy consumption horizontally. And my takeaway from this chart is really simple. If you want to be prosperous to a certain level, you need at least a certain level of energy access. You need to not only have access to it, you need to be able to afford it. Now, how does energy affect fertility? I said it enables prosperity. Now I'd like to show its connection to fertility. You remember this graph, those colored boxes. Now, here is the energy use average in each of those 4 boxes. That group in the pink box, those are the developed countries, they use about 33 megawatt hours per person per year on average. That's a good lifestyle, and they have very low fertility. And the developing group in the lower right, they have only 6 megawatt hours per person per year, and they have high fertility. That mysterious group in the lower left, they use 10 megawatt hours. Maybe just moving up from 6 to 10 is enough to lower your fertility. I'm not sure. And that one outlier, Malaysia, is clearly a developed country. How come it has high fertility? Because it didn't get that prosperity until recently. And it takes a little while after you're prosperous before the population or the birth rate falls. For context, I said 6 megawatt hours per person per year was the poorest nations on earth. Now, that was the worldwide average 2 centuries ago. How did we get more since then? By burning fossil fuels. Yeah, there's a little hydroelectric, a little nuclear contribution, but they're small. Over 90% comes from burning fossil fuels. Some people say, well, where's the solar? Where's the wind? At the time this chart was prepared in 2010, the worldwide use of those sources was invisible on this plot, so tiny. Now for my caveat about raising my hand. It's clear that energy is crucial to prosperity, and that's crucial to getting through the demographic transition, which is crucial to controlling population. And equally clear, we must stop burning organic material to get energy, or we are going to kill our species and a lot of others through climate change. If and only if we can find a technical means to solve the global climate change problem, maybe we can have a larger population than we have now. And by the way, on another occasion, I could give you a lecture about my proposal for how we can solve that problem. I think, and most of the climate scientists I've talked to think, that the present plans that all the nations are making, the agreement they just signed with great fanfare a week ago, is not going to do the job. It's not nearly going to do the job. And so the climate scientists are fearful that we are about to go extinct, and there's nothing we can do about it. They've been telling us for 40 years, but we've been ignoring them. Well, but is it desirable to have a larger population? What would be the optimal population? Well, this is my last chart. This comes from data collected by Angus Maddison, who was a real nut of an economist in Scotland. He really wanted to know not only what is the current GDP and the current population in every country on Earth, he wanted to know what was it historically for the last 2,000 years. And so he has collected that data. He died a few years ago, but his peers so respected his work that they are keeping up the additions to this database, and that's where the last two data points come from, because he was dead by 2005. But this is a graph of prosperity, average prosperity for a person on the earth, a human, versus the population on the earth. And the amazing thing is it is a rising line. If you think about it a minute, if we were in an age of scarcity, if there was a resource that was limiting us, as soon as you have more people, everybody gets less of that, on average at least. And that would mean the prosperity of everybody goes down on average. So you'd expect this curve to come down at the right side instead of going up. But it's still going up. Now, you might wonder, well, why is it going up at all? And that's a good question for another day because I'm running out of time. But I'll tell you, I do have an answer. It's called a network effect. You can look that up. But the point is, watch that curve. Keep adding to this database and keep watching this curve. And when this curve starts to curve over, maybe then we've reached our optimum population. So my summary is that energy enables prosperity, which drives the demographic transition, which enables population control, but the energy involved has to be inexpensive, clean, green energy. Cheap green energy is the only key to population control. Thank you. Now, at the right, one last thing. I told you there were 2 slides coming here. I wanted to mention 3 books. This book by Alan Weissman called Countdown is the successor to his very famous book, The World Without Us. In that book, he imagined what would the world be like if all the humans disappeared right away, overnight. And he concluded that in a not very long time, it would be actually quite a nice place. And then he said to his publisher, but I really wish that some of us could stick around. I wonder how many. And he wanted to write a book about that, and his publisher said, oh no, not demographics, that's just economics with people. But he wrote it so charmingly that it is actually a fascinating and thrilling read. I recommend it highly. He still thinks that 2 billion people is the correct maximum or optimal number of humans on the planet, but for the reasons I've already explained, I think he doesn't understand the energy connection and doesn't therefore know what he's talking about in that regard. This book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert, she's a New Yorker writer, among other things, and she's written a charming, equally charming book. The idea of extinction, of species going extinct, is actually a very recent human idea. We didn't even imagine that was possible until just over 200 years ago. But of course, it's been going on for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And then she goes through and has many chapters, each one of which is headed with the Latin name for a particular species that went extinct, or has gone extinct, or is going extinct. The last chapter is Homo sapiens. The last book is a little skinnier than the others. It's available in the back of the room. I wrote it. It's called Avoiding the Extinction of Humanity, A Practical Plan. And this is where you'll learn what I'm proposing in terms of a new global infrastructure by which we could, in fact, escape this disastrous end that otherwise I think is inevitable. And here is that data slide you may want to photograph showing you where I found the data for today's talk. Thank you. I'll be back up here around 3 for the panel if you have questions.